basically, this, as you see on your screen now, this is being recorded. Just to say, we also intend at the moment to record not only Chris's presentation, but also the question and answer session at the end. So we will record that unless we have any objections. If you do have any objections to that, if you please put in the chat to Martin Bell, and therefore he will stop the recording at that point of view. So we'll assume it's okay unless we hear otherwise. The plan is we've got about 90 minutes in total. It's up to Chris how long of that time he takes, but the usual pattern is roughly about 45 minutes or so presentation, followed by up to about 45 minutes discussion. And in a few minutes, when Chris shares screen, we will all be on the right-hand side of the screen. So we've found in past events, it's probably best if people indicate in the chat any questions that they might have. So in a sense, just put down a placeholder and we'll come back to that at the end. Generally by default in chronological order, but if there are linked questions, we'll try and take them together. So if you can indicate in the chat if you want to ask any questions, that'll be fine. So I think we're about ready to go now. I'll let Chris introduce himself, both with his HSMC link and what he's going to say today. So Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Martin. Okay, I'll just share screen. Hopefully you can all see that. I've tried to be clever and use a Prezi, which will almost certainly blow up in my face at some point. But yeah, thanks very much. So it's really, thanks everyone for coming as well. It's really great to be able to give this seminar today. So yeah, so today's seminar, I'm not really presenting any research findings or anything. I'm more just kind of using it as an excuse to explore this term critical friend. It's one I've encountered a lot in my career before academia, and then to my surprise also it started kind of springing up a lot when I joined academia as well. Yeah, so I won't be providing a definitive answer in my presentation, but I just like to use it as a way of stimulating some discussion about kind of how research interacts with policymakers and the ethics behind that, using HSMC as a case study. But really, they're just questions I'm kind of interested in. That would be great to have other people's thoughts on. And I'll kind of use the ideas of Max Weber as a sort of a starting point almost, because he's the kind of someone who wrote extensively about these kind of issues. But before doing so, I will give you some background on who I actually am. So yeah, so in terms of introduction, I feel like HSMC and me sounds kind of more romantic than I was planning for it, but that's I have quite a long-standing relationship with HSMC. Again, I'm making that sound unintentionally romantic, but yeah, so I first it's about 10 years I've been associated, and that's when I did my MSc in leadership and service improvement as part of the NHS management training scheme. So I was on the general management stream for that. And that's when I first met Martin and Mark and Yestin and lots of other people. I then came to do my PhD at, split between HSMC and Department of Social Policy and Social Work as it was then, 2016 to 2020. So my PhD was called Moral Economy in the NHS, the Normative Dimension of Service Change. So what my PhD was, it was essentially the aim was to apply a sociological concept of moral economy to understanding a case of large-scale service change in the NHS using qualitative case study design. And that's kind of where my interest in kind of social research and ethics and also the sociology of morality kind of started. And then very recently, I'm actually working with HSMC now, so which I didn't know I would be when I kind of put my hat in the ring to do a seminar. But yeah, I very recently started working on the voluntary sector commissioning project with Mark Exworthy and Angela Ellis-Payne. So yeah, so now I am a member of HSMC. Yeah, so in terms of the reasons for this topic and why I chose it, it's basically, like I say, I've come across this term critical friend a lot in my professional life, and I have very mixed feelings about it. So I first kind of encountered it when I was working in third sector influencing roles, and it was a way that kind of policy and campaigns teams in the charity sector often try to characterize the kind of more constructive arm of their kind of influencing activity, trying to be a critical friend to government and policymakers. So really, yeah, an attempt to articulate that positive relationship. But I think it's often used, sort of understandably used, to kind of paper over or kind of gloss over some quite thorny ethical tensions, both involved in kind of charity campaigns work, but also I've realized in academia as well, because like I say, I've started encountering it in academia as well. And I think it actually goes to some quite fundamental issues regarding what the point is of social research and how it relates to policy making, and how scholars, as it said in the abstract for this presentation, how scholars can pursue knowledge for its own sake, whilst also making an impact in the kind of real world, in inverted commas, of policy and practice. I find Max Weber a really helpful kind of lens to consider some of these issues. He has quite a sophisticated, but also somewhat controversial sometimes, or disputed view on the role of social science, sort of the nature of objectivity in social science and what role value should play in it. So I thought it might be useful, not necessarily to come to any answers to this, but just to open up debate. And the thing that prompted me to choose this topic was really just reading and reviewing the HSMC, the front page on the website, where critical friendship is kind of in the first bit describing what HSMC does. So the quote I'll read out from the website. So the Health Services Management Centre at the University of Birmingham is one of the UK's foremost centres for research, evaluation, teaching and professional development for health and social care organisations. HSMC has established a unique reputation as a critical friend of the healthcare community and strives constantly to bridge the gap between research and practice. So yeah, so from HSMC's perspective, on the surface, critical friendship is a really important way of bridging this gap between research and sort of the real world, again, of policy and practice. And yeah, and obviously like here it, yeah, and I just sort of like to really explore those issues a bit further, because I think there are kind of positives and negatives to framing the relationship between scholarship and policy making and practice in this way. So the rest of the presentation, I'm going to try and deconstruct very slightly the idea of what a critical friend is, just by going back to some basic definitions. Then I will talk about what Max Weber would have thought about this idea by presenting just a quick overview of his view of the relationship between social science and policy and practice. And then I'll kind of just break down some of HSMC's, just a small subsample of HSMC's research themes to look into this to kind of apply that to what HSMC does. And then I have some questions for discussion, which I definitely welcome people kind of picking up. So what is a critical friend? So thanks to Google, I did some very quick kind of research on how this has been defined, particularly in academic journals, thanks to Google Scholar. And it's usually associated with education and professional development in terms of academic journals. And it can be defined as a trusted person who asks provocative questions, provides data to be examined through another lens, and offers a critique of the person's work as a friend. So on the surface, a lot of this seems completely appropriate, I think, for the way academics might contribute to policy and practice. But the thing that's always kind of irked me and worried me a bit is this idea of friendship. Most definitions include this idea. So obviously for critical friend, friendship is a key component of this. So even though this is a very kind of self-evident term, I have kind of just gone back to the dictionary to double check what it means and how it can be defined. And you see there's kind of these various popular definitions. So a person you know well and like a lot, who's not a member of your family, someone who's not an enemy who you can trust, a person who has a strong liking for and trust another person, someone you know well and like who is not related to you. So you see, like, most definitions include this idea of two people sharing a very strong affinity and solidarity between each other, kind of knowing each other very well and sharing a bond of trust. But then there's this idea of critical, sorry, that heading should say critical, not friend. There's this idea of critical, which is kind of almost borderline on contradictory to friend, but kind of could be seen as complementing it. So in social science, the idea of criticality often suggests a kind of a normative position that academics bring to research that is then used as a standpoint from which to critique policy and practice. So this could include things like a desire to reduce poverty, an aim to reduce inequality and discrimination, a wish to empower underrepresented voices, such as HSMC's work around enhancing patient and public participation. And basically, my discomfort mainly comes from this idea of friendship with policymakers and the extent to which it's appropriate for academics to place themselves in a position of friendship to people who tend, not always, especially when you're talking about practitioners as well, but people who tend to hold quite powerful positions in society. So often the idea that it's the role of universities to be a kind of friend, even a critical one, to policymakers can feel hard to accept for me. Does this disadvantage other less powerful groups? And I'm also, just going back to that issue of criticality, I'm also kind of torn the extent to the role of normative standpoints in social research and the extent to which social research can do that or not. And I'm genuinely torn, like my PhD supervisors will tell you that I'm really go back and forth on this issue. But at the same time, I do appreciate the need for sort of constructive engagement with those formulating policy, because people in these positions often have to navigate complex practical and ethical decisions. They're often under intense pressure, and offering critique but also support kind of makes sense from that perspective. Okay, so to help, yeah, I've turned to social theory. Sorry, I'm laughing at myself because my background is as a sociologist, and my old PhD supervisors would tell you that whenever I'm confused about something, I tend to often, rather not very helpfully, turn to social theory for answers. Usually classical social theory, actually usually Emil Durkheim, but increasingly now Max Weber. And as luck would have it, Weber has an awful lot to say on this issue, between sort of the interface between social science and kind of the real world, again in inverted commas, of policy and practice. But to understand kind of Weber's view on the relationship between academia and the real world sort of policy problems, practice problems, it's important to understand his view on the role of values in social research. But to understand that, it's kind of necessary to understand what I termed his somewhat bleak views regarding human nature and the role of meaning in social life. So Weber's position on meaning is basically that meaning is absolutely necessary for social action, in that people act on the meanings they attribute to the world around them. So action is not possible without people having subjective meanings. But at the same time, because Weber's very influenced by these kind of neo-Kantian schools of thought, meaning is also seen as somewhat arbitrary, in that meanings can't be found in the objective world around us. They're instead inscribed onto people, onto reality by people. But people can never fully acknowledge this. They have to act like the meanings they hold in their head are intrinsically valid and part of the objective world. So there's kind of this ambivalent, almost contradictory nature of meaning. And on top of this, all meanings are only ever partial and selective. So reality is way too complex to comprehend in its entirety. So meanings help us select and filter what is relevant to us and help us practically act in the world around us. And this is very valid to value judgments, because value judgments are a key form of meaning making from Weber's perspective. When I've taught this, the metaphor I like to use is this kind of idea, the metaphor of vision, sort of analogy almost for understanding the role of meaning in social life from Weber's perspective. So in terms of vision and the role that eye and brain play in created images of the world around us. So kind of in objective reality, the world is just buzzing with all this electromagnetic energy. There's a huge range of frequencies bouncing around. The human eye is highly selective. It's only able to pick up on a narrow range of frequencies that turn into electrical signals that go to our brain. And then our brains are able to make sense of these signals through our instincts, but also learned concepts. And then when they're able to make sense, we're able to practically act in the world around us. So it's necessarily selective and partial. We notice some things and not others because it would be impossible to act without that. And our learned concepts are an important part of this. Our learned concepts are a really important part of this. So for instance, I'm looking at a computer, someone from another historical era wouldn't be able to recognize that particular configuration of light and electrical signals as a computer because they hadn't learned the concept. And the way we make sense of the social world is kind of the same. There's an infinite complexity of social phenomena. We need our meanings in our head to make sense of it and act, but that's necessarily partial. And sorry, I know I zoomed out a lot there and went down to philosophical questions. At this stage, you might be wondering why I did that, and justifiably so, and what that's got to do with critical friendship. It's basically because from Weber's point of view, values are a key part of research because they set the endpoints, what's seen as like valid goals of policymakers, of sort of valid goals of research, but also they're kind of dangerous as well because they can get in the way of us making appropriate causal connections and appropriate interpretations, like accurate interpretations of the course of events. So as I say, values often set the ends we strive towards, but from Weber's point of view, just as meaning is kind of arbitrary, so are values. So we can't find values in the external world, which means empirical social science or rational deliberation can't help us judge which values are right and which are wrong. But Weber holds that objective social science is still possible because, like, despite the subjective nature of interpretation, it's still possible to formulate accounts of causal processes and actually fold in the role of people's meaning making into this. In fact, yeah, this process relies on certain epistemic values like a commitment to truth for its own sake, and finding the most effective path to accurate answers to factual questions. But academics, and Weber's view is kind of academics must foreground these epistemic values over political or moral beliefs, you know, like the belief, even like beliefs like society should be more egalitarian or there should be less crime or things like that. It's more about just formulating appropriate what the actual course of causal connections. So it's kind of the role of researchers to minimize the impact of these values on the conclusions they draw. But, and sorry, I am working my way back around to policymakers and the link between academia and policymakers. So there's this concept of value relevance in Weber, which basically talks about how values also have a completely shaped social research with respect to the topics we choose to study. So the act of choosing to study any specific aspect of social life requires value relevance, which refers to the idea that social phenomena have to be relevant to a particular set of values to kind of jump out as something worth studying. So they have to have relevance to certain issues or questions that have some significance to some members of society. And indeed, you could understand social science as a way of understanding social problems. But you can't define social problems without values, be it kind of, so if you see social problems, if you define it as inequality, antisocial behavior, poverty, crime, etc., you need some sort of value framework to define those against, i.e. a belief that poverty is bad and should be fought against. But from Weber's perspective, it doesn't really matter if a social scientist shares that value relevance framework or not. They can sort of come from anywhere as long as they're relevant. And it doesn't matter if a social scientist shares that, because the job of the social scientist is very specifically to kind of find proper explanations for what has happened, kind of objective explanations, as he put it. There are lots of issues with that perspective. Namely, it's unclear where these value relevance frameworks come from and how they're used to decide what to study. And I guess a critique that could be aimed at it is it's kind of intrinsically conservative, because most of the time these value relevance frameworks might come from policymakers or people of power who are funding research, which would make social science quite conservative in nature potentially, like against reform. But anyway, so just to finish off with Weber, so there's 4 different relations that research and policy can have from this point of view that can be contrasted with this idea of critical friendship. This is my interpretation, so take it with a pinch of salt. So I see it as there's a kind of a non-empirical or quasi-empirical element. So researchers can conduct an assessment of the internal consistency of the relationship between values which a person holds. For instance, with the NHS long-term plan, this includes a commitment to certain efficiencies, productivity goals, ambitious goals about transforming care, shifting focus to prevention, improving quality and outcomes, increasing staffing in digital services. One role the research could play with this is actually to provide a critique or an assessment of whether these values are internally consistent with each other. And sort of linked to this also, another role is to evaluate whether different ends, such as those ends just outlined, themselves are possible given the historical circumstances. And then there's an empirical element to what social scientists can bring. So analysis can show what means are suitable for achieving certain ends. So that's almost like your classic kind of benefit realizations, almost kind of not benefit realizations, but just mapping out what steps are most likely to achieving impact, such as for improving patient outcomes or better public and patient engagement. And then it can also help sort of appraising different means against each other in the ability to achieve certain goals, which is your classic cost benefit analysis, is something that researchers can bring to policy and practice. And yeah, the question I've asked here now, just to bring it back to the initial question, is would Weber be a critical friend? And I don't really have a clear answer to this, because I think there are some things that are similar with his approach and some things are different. So there's kind of some overlaps here. The idea of being a friend could be linked with kind of Weber's focus on finding value relevant frameworks, and how policymakers are clearly an important source of value relevant frameworks, and that what a policymaker sees as a pressing issue is an important issue for the day. So it's kind of seems appropriate for academics to focus around that. But I think the term critical friend implies a level of acceptance that would be problematic from a Weberian perspective. So for instance, I feel like many goals wouldn't pass the first kind of two non-empirical tests I set out. Initially, kind of internal consistency and how likely they are to be achieved, because a lot of policy goals in themselves tend to be quite contradictory. And I think a lot of conversations between academics and policymakers would end there if it was kind of followed by a strictly Weberian sense. And at the same time, and somewhat paradoxically, the term critical implies that policy ends are being evaluated against some sort of ethical standard, which is something Weber is unlikely to support as well. Okay, and finally, and I'm nearly done, I just wanted to take those ideas and kind of just go through some accounts of HSMC's activity, because I think the extent to which HSMC is a critical friend, or maybe closer to a Weberian kind of approach, or a different approach entirely probably, is quite debatable. But so, for instance, the work on leadership, which is closest to my kind of early history with HSMC, a lot of HSMC's leadership training isn't just focused on kind of giving accounts of the most effective means to reach the ends of government in terms of leadership. I think HSMC and its leadership training often sees leadership as a good thing if it's done in the right way, as defined by HSMC's values. And it kind of has this idea leadership is important, good leadership can help people flourish, and therefore HSMC wants to promote good leadership. And I'd say that's kind of closer to being a critical friend, because while it's providing leadership training, it's also providing a particular perspective on leadership. I think the work of Brace, and you'll have to forgive me on all of this because I'm not actually an expert in HSMC's work, and I don't want to upset anyone in my first week. I feel like on the face of it, at least on the website, the work of Brace, there's a lot of stuff that is more kind of classically Weberian, in that sense of helping people find the best means to find their ends in kind of evaluative work, saying what works to help people achieve their ends. And then finally, on the kind of decision making and planning, I see this as kind of a mix. So knowing what I do about Yeston's work in particular, I know a big part of his priority setting work, it does take a kind of normative view, or provides normative critiques on what policymakers should perhaps be considering prioritizing. But at the same time, it kind of helps policymakers reflect on their own values and how they might achieve those. So, you know, theory, empirical understanding, and practical wisdom. So yeah, so that's my presentation. So yeah, sorry, it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of several things, but I hope it might have provoked some kind of questions or thoughts or reflections. Like I say, this is all stuff that I kind of think about a lot and try to think what kind of the best relationship between policy and sort of academia and policy and practice is. So these are just some questions I've thought of, but really I'm happy for any questions or comments or reflections. So for instance, like, what is the relationship between HSMC or like academics in general and policymakers? What's appropriate? Should HSMC be a critical friend? Is HSMC a critical friend? Will the task of being a critical friend to policymakers become more difficult given the current challenging kind of economic and political climate? And then another question, like, is Weber still a kind of a useful or relevant lens to explore these issues? Would he be a critical friend? What other perspectives, such as kind of critical standpoints, which I touched upon, might be useful, because Weber sort of goes in and out of fashion as all these thinkers do. So yeah, so that's my presentation. I hope it was okay. I'm going to stop sharing now and pass back over to Martin.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. As of now, I didn't see any questions in the chat. So one thing, we have one question now, but yeah, to use the phrase I started, so I'll finish, but I will come to Mark in a second. Just to remind people that this is part of HSMC's 50th anniversary. So the aim was to get people associated with HSMC. So in Chris, rather, we got sort of 2 for the price of 1, although I think that's going to be the government supposedly getting around to stopping bog-offs, isn't it, in due course. Chris was invited because he was a PhD student formerly associated with HSMC, but now he's rejoined us again. And one thing he'll discover fairly quickly, I know we're not meant to do this, but we often use quite a lot of football analogies in HSMC. So I was going to hold up the ball for a few minutes while people thought of a question, but now clearly Mark has thought of a question. So I'll go over to Mark. So Mark.
Did Nicola have her hand up first, I think? No? Okay, sorry. Thanks, Chris. Really, really interesting. I don't think we've really looked at the idea of critical friend before. Well, I've been here anyway. But I was wondering whether there's almost, from a researcher's point of view, the value of being the critical friend helps you get into the room in the first place. And the distinction I've often thought about is this research for policy and research on policy. And in some ways, research for policy is sort of that advice you give, very much applied, whereas research on policy is researching the policy process. Now, of course, both can happen at the same time. And I'm just wondering whether critical friend is very much research for policy, and the critical bit, if we drop the friend bit, is research on policy. Because research on policy is not always welcomed, or it's not always used, or it's not, you know, it's often just dismissed quite readily. Whereas the critical friend bit is very much research for policy. There's a purpose to it, applied purpose, which is the purpose of the people who've either commissioned you or in the building room that you're in. So that's helpful once you're in. So I just wonder whether that distinction, research on policy, research for policy, sort of sheds a bit more light even to the extent of how we do the research methodologically. Once you're inside the room, you can be the ethnographer, you can do those, you can get much more access to data, to individuals, etc. I'd just be interested on your views.
Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of interpretive device to understand it. And I remember that was, when I was in the third sector as well, that was often the kind of the dilemma people had, is that they would have a different agenda to government, but they also knew that to influence someone, you need to kind of get in the room, be close to them. And I think the tension there always is that to get into the room, you have to present yourself in a way which is kind of amenable to the people with power who you want to be in the room with. And then it's the extent to which the efforts of getting into the room might limit your limit your ability to do that critical kind of research on policy bit. And I don't have an answer to that either, because I think just having worked in both sectors, I think that is a genuine dilemma, and two things to balance off, like how do you actually get into, how do you get people listening to you without compromising your aims? And I think the thing that Weber makes you think about is that should it be the job of social scientists to have those aims in the first place as part of their job, kind of in there. I've seen Will's turned on his camera. So maybe he knows, I don't know. When I was doing my PhD, Will was always the person I'd ask these questions to, but yeah, so it is useful, and I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it as well. And just hearing you talk about it is kind of reassuring to hear someone else kind of describe those potential tensions in a different way as well. It's something that might be shared. So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Yeah, good.
Okay, Nicola.
Hi, Chris. Good to put my hand there now. Thank you very much. I agree with Mark. I mean, I've been at HMSC since 2013, and I think the term critical friend was definitely in the mission at that point and hasn't changed since. I'm sure, I don't know about whether Vega would have turned his camera on or off, but yeah, I don't. I'm sure Will's got a more intellectual answer to this than me. But when you were talking, there were kind of two things that jumped out at me. One was this point about the normative stuff, which I think is really, really important. And I think we do, you know, that identification as a kind of critical social scientist kind of brings with it a whole set of normative things that are sometimes more and less visible. And this is, I guess, the question that comes out of that for me is, how do you think that plays out in the way that a lot of NIHR funding operates at the moment? So with NIHR funding, there's this sort of requirement to start your application, both like physically in terms of the first thing you fill in on the application, but also in terms of the timescales of engaging with patients in the public and wider communities. And also then the idea that your project has to have this direct NHS benefit. And so I wondered if you have anything that you wanted to kind of reflect on in relation to that thing, which seems so very central to every aspect of NIHR funding at the moment.
That's really interesting. Yes, because I don't really, to my shame, I don't know that much about NIHR, the funding process, even though for the last 3.5 days they have paid my salary. Yeah, I think that's interesting, because for me that sounds like the process does, at least on the face of it, bring the researcher into line with the value relevance frameworks of NIHR. But some of those, the patient and public participation, I know, and I probably should have used it as an example for HSMC's work, is that's something that there's a very strong commitment to, and there's loads of really great stuff that's been done with HSMC on that. So that's almost like a value relevance framework that's shared. But then the idea that it has to be of a benefit to the NHS, I guess then you're looking at, well, how do insiders in the NHS, how do they define benefits? And is it the same as those endpoints? And is it the same as what I define as a worthy endpoint or not? And it may be, or it may not. And I guess that's part of my question about sort of going forward as well. Whether that, I don't know whether that will become more difficult, just because there are so many pressures on, well, there has been for at least the last 10 years, there's so many pressures on public funding that increasingly, what will the actual priorities of those bodies be? And I think I go round and round with this kind of, should social science be critical or not? Like, genuinely, I'm completely muddled up about it, because I agree that it would be very hard for me not to have some sort of value aims that are personal to me when I'm doing my research and bring those to my research. But then in my PhD, I got really into the work of, in my first year, I got really into the work of like Andrew Sayre and talking about critical standpoints and social scientists defining their critical standpoints. And then I realized in my second year that to actually do that, I'd have to become a moral philosopher to actually have a clearly defined ethical standpoint that I could kind of put forward and defend in an academic way. That is actually almost like becoming a moral philosopher. So I honestly don't know, and that might be an unfair characterization, but I don't think I have the time or skill as a philosopher to do that. So it's kind of like I'm really torn on that as well. And I'm sorry to answer your reflection with another reflection, because I really don't know, but it was a really good reflection because it's got me thinking and rambling slightly, but thank you.
Sorry, can I follow up with a second one, Martin? Is that allowed? So that was my sort of question, and then I guess as best to sort of answer is, how do you manage this in real life? And I think for me, I guess I've tried to, a lot of my projects have been NIHR funded, and they often have very practical, and I would say quite short-term aims in terms of what counts as benefit for the NHS or benefit for patients. And so the kind of solution, as best as it can be a solution often for me, is to just write two things when I do research. So I write one thing that is quite clinically focused and gets published in a clinical journal that says, look, this is what I learned and this is what you could do better. And then I write another one that is much more of a sort of step back. Let's look at it in the broader context. Let's understand it in terms of societal change and what the critical issues are, and perhaps some of, you know, the bigger trends and patterns that this particular case is an example of. And I think maybe the fact that you have to write two separate papers means that maybe it is slightly unresolvable.
Yeah, well, that's sort of reassuring in a way, but also not. So, but I think that sounds like a good kind of practical solution, to almost have two hats that you can wear and see it as two roles that are linked but distinct, maybe.
Okay, Yestin's put something in the chat about being uncomfortable, so I'm going to make him feel a bit more uncomfortable by asking whether he'd like to expand on that a little bit. So, Yestin?
I mean, I don't have a huge amount. It's quite a long comment, I think you'll find, but I think I always find it slightly frustrating that we use that phrase too easily to try and encapsulate what we do as a department. You know, there are many different audiences for our work. So are we a critical friend to patient groups, to clinical, you know, the royal colleges, the academic community, even industry? I just think the phrase is too narrow and doesn't capture the range of what we do and its potential impact. I don't think it's wrong for us to adopt the role of critical friend in certain instances, but I don't think it's the dominant one, or certainly isn't how I imagine our kind of primary role as an academic unit. Does that explain it?
That does, but also I think we've got a very pragmatic answer from Deborah. So Deborah, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I can't hear Deborah, can you?
You had that chipmunk voice again, Deborah, that comes out every now and then.
Yeah, well, we're having either sound problems or you've on laughing gas or something, Deborah. Should we come back to you in a few seconds? Hopefully you might be able to sort out your IT issues.
Not working.
Yeah, it's working now. Yeah.
Oh, well, I haven't changed anything. Okay. All right.
There you go.
Clicked off it and clicked back on again. I think all I wanted to say was very little thought was put into the term when the university deemed it no longer possible to do consultancy and to move away from that, but we still wanted to do engagement work with people in the field, particularly NHS trusts. We looked, I think Robin Miller, in fact, probably put this up for a term that spoke to somehow the relationship between, you know, using evidence to suggest, you know, a particular way of doing something, whether it be change or otherwise, and what was out there and what was happening. And I guess this was in part to, as you said earlier on, kind of bridge that gap between kind of evidence and practice, you know, between academia and the field, and not to be to have a so as you say, to have a relationship in that process rather than just to be critical, so that it was something that was more constructive, I guess. So that was behind it. Just as an aside to this, and I was kind of thinking about what you were saying about Weber talking about kind of meaning being necessary for social action, and the University of Birmingham being a civic university. So our values are based in social action, and also of the requirement for universities to have impact, which requires action, social or otherwise, and how can we not, in a way, get into that space? So just other thoughts.
Okay, Mark, I think you've got another take on critical friend. So would you like to say something about that?
Well, yeah, I was only going to say that the term isn't just, I know it's not implying it's just our term, but you know, it's used in other circles as well. I've heard it mentioned by non-executives. So non-executives being sort of semi-independent, being able to come in from outside the NHS to talk about that, those difficult issues that might not otherwise be heard. So that, and that's my second comment, that there's that sort of transition that we can make, and we've got the privilege of making, between being on the inside, the applied, the impact, but also stepping back and being a bit more independent. So how we operate on that sliding scale, when we operate, what hats we are wearing when we are at different points on that scale, I think have implications for things like training. How do we train researchers to operate in those different settings? Obviously, if you're talking to an NHS audience, you're clearly wearing one type of hat, but at what point do you swap hats, and how do you gain the skills to operate in those different environments? I think there's some very practical implications, as well as some of the more philosophical ones, which you've raised very nicely, Chris.
Okay, we've got quite a long comment in the chat from Gilles, who uses the phrase thinking aloud. So would you actually now like to think aloud and say something to Chris?
Yeah, so sorry, it is quite long. It is, as an outsider, really, you know, a couple of decades ago, I dabbled a bit in international health aid consultancies. And I picture there are two scenarios. They're quite hyperbolic, and I think they also kind of fit in what Deborah says about the university not wanting you to do consultancies. So if, say, the scenario is that you commission an evaluation of a program or something, and you think it's really bad, then you choose a consultant or someone who you know is very thorough and very honest. If you think it's really bad, but you want it to go on, you choose another one. And you see, and I want you to tell me something. How do you see that, Chris, this kind of phenomenon? It's all too human. It's all too human. And then obviously it could also be kind of material, your material future, if you do critical and all that. And at the same time, there's a lot to say for very close, continuous, very well, you know, managed. I don't know if you can be too friendly relationships because of the expertise that you have, say, HSMC, in particular parts of the NHS. So I'm very keen to know what you think in terms of your own views and that of Max Weber.
That's a really great point, and really interesting to see it from sort of the other side as well, of when people want a critique or want someone to give them feedback, it really depends on where they are, who they'll go to. And yeah, of course, if you're working in a highly pressurized environment where you will be judged personally on the outcomes of an evaluation, then it would be, you know, it would be very human. You can see it would be very human to be tempted to do that. And yeah, it just makes me think maybe because I guess universities do exist within this wider kind of evaluation market, where there's lots of management consultancies, lots of think tanks, lots of other organizations and universities, all kind of who are options for public or private sector or third sector organizations who want this kind of evaluation work. And where maybe universities' place in that should always be to pitch themselves as the people who will be most closely aligned to those sort of epistemic values I outlined that Weber said about, like, most keen to just give you answers that reflect the as much as is possible the true kind of causal events of what caused what. And that maybe, when I think you mentioned the word integrity, and then maybe universities and academics being the people who you would trust most to have integrity to those values, because they would be hopefully surrounded by an institution that supported them to have them and didn't put them under pressure to just get contracts from people, regardless of whether they sort of cared about whether what you were saying was sort of accurate to some sort of external truth or not, if that makes any sense. There's some problematic concepts I've used there, but yeah.
Okay, just to say, I'm going to sort of hold the ball up for another few minutes. Just in answer to what just been said, many years ago, we did some work for the NHS, but unfortunately, we gave them the wrong answer, the answer they didn't want. And surprise, surprise, they didn't come back to us and ask for any more. So I think that's partly an answer to your question. But I think,
Martin, did that create any, just out of interest, it's fine if you can't say, but did that create any institutional kickback for you, or was that seen?
Not really, no. I mean, to be fair, we weren't talking millions of pounds. So it wasn't, the accountants wouldn't have been wouldn't have had too many sleepless nights about it. But it was just an interesting observation that, clearly it was the wrong answer, which... But never mind. It's almost like that barrister, isn't it? You, as a barrister, you should never ask a question that you don't know the answer to. So unfortunately, they asked us and got the wrong answer. But what I know about Max Weber, you could write on the back of a matchbox. So I'm going to use two other sort of thoughts about where I would fit this idea about means and ends that you talked about earlier. And for me, the first one is in terms of the different types of evaluation research. So perhaps this oversimplifies a little bit, but does, you're talking about means and ends and critical friend. Would being a critical friend be more to do with evaluability? In other words, we've got this idea and how do you think it will pan out? Or formative evaluation, we're doing something and can we improve it while it is being rolled out? Rather than summative or impact evaluation, the idea that this thing is now being done and tell us what you think about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's sort of sense check an idea, but so would you see that as more as part of Weber's kind of idea of one role of research can be to tell you how likely it is for a certain end to be realized? Or would you see that as part of more of a sort of critical friend function of someone you trust, who you can have those conversations with, who might have a different point of view, but will give you an honest appraisal? Yeah, just wondering.
Okay, well, I'll do a politician's answer. In other words, I haven't got a clue to the answer to that, so I'll say something completely different and avoid the question. So I've no idea what Weber would think, whether he would switch on his camera or not, or anything to do with that. But I mean, another take for me would be, in addition to that sort of types of evaluation, would be the debate between rational policy making, which, you start off in means and ends, Herbert Simon's notion on rational policy making, as opposed to Lindblom's take on incremental policy making. So, in theory, as Simon was saying, the classic sort of means ends start is where, you start off with a blank piece of paper. You think, okay, what are the goals of this on a blank piece of paper? What are the means? Set out all the different strategies, which is the best cost benefit analysis. Let's go with the one in which benefits maximizes costs. So although I know nothing about Weber, I know a little bit about Herbert Simon. So that seems to have some relevance to me on the way we approach policy making. Any thoughts on that, Chris? So I've held up the ball well enough. So Matty's come in with a hand up. So over to you, Matty.
Hi, Chris. Really interesting. I'm doing my PhD at the Institute for Local Government Studies. So very similar relationship to policy that you do have, yeah. So definitely questions we should be exploring there. In terms of the question I've got for you, I was just wondering, what do you think the implication of the critical friend identity is for us as academics conceptualizing the process of conceptualization about things? Do we base our conceptualizations upon what our friends in the policy world say and explore why things are meaningful to them? Or do we tell our friends in the policy world that the way they think is actually not very clear, and we as critical friends can offer nicely packaged, well-defined concepts to help them see the world more clearly?
Such a good question, thank you. Because my PhD was about kind of trying to develop a concept, moral economy, to help understand service change and the process of that. But then you suddenly come to realize there's well, who does this help understand it? Because it certainly helped me understand it, and it was probably would be useful for other academics who are used to using kind of sociological concepts or sort of abstract concepts. But yeah, it makes me but then when you actually, I imagine when you want to engage with policymakers, it's the extent to which they have concepts that they use in the day-to-day life that make sense to them, which you might not as an academic think makes sense or are kind of inherently contradictory. And again, it's like to have an interface with a different professional group, you kind of need to be able to speak their language, but by speaking their language, you might water down the concept. I don't know if that's the way your question has kind of filtered through in my head. I don't know whether it's a good filtering or not. And again, it's unfortunate. It's one of those questions that I think maybe there's more experienced kind of academics here might be able to answer, who have kind of had more of those interactions and have had success in that, because for me it's like an ongoing thing, like how do I maybe improve or sharpen everyday concepts in a way that doesn't make them inaccessible, and how do you make accessible abstract theoretical concepts so that other people can use them to make sense of what's going on around them, and hopefully kind of be more effective actors and more effective in kind of achieving, I guess, worthwhile ends. But again, that's worthwhile to who? Again, that's problematic. So I'm kind of tying myself in knots. But I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Matthew, but I really enjoyed trying to answer it anyway. So thank you.
Okay. Should we? Is there anyone who hasn't said anything yet? So quite happy to allow people to give a first question before we allow people to come back for any seconds. So it's a bit like an auctioneer's hammer, you know, that the hammer's poised at the moment. So just give you time enough to either unmute yourself or put your hand up before I allow people to come back in for any second goes. Okay, right, we're gone on the first offer. So anyone want to come back in with seconds?
I'll have a go, Martin.
Okay, thanks, Nicola.
It's not a direct answer to the previous question, but what it made me think about in terms of what can your concepts offer in those discussions that you have. I was thinking about in the interdisciplinary work that we often do within the health services research and health sciences research, that sometimes I feel like my kind of role in steering groups on interdisciplinary projects is just to like sit there and ask awkward questions, because I sometimes feel like our kind of critical perspective, I guess this is a critical part of our social science, is the one that kind of when people are just sort of going about their everyday business, you sort of get people to stop and think, okay, why am I doing it in this way? And what am I reproducing, particularly in terms of power relationships? I do quite a lot of global health research. And so there's a kind of, you know, these constant dynamics of the relationship between you know, UK universities and, you know, universities in other parts of the world. I'm doing some work in Mali at the moment. So we've got all sorts of power relationships about, you know, culture, colonialism, language, all these sorts of things. And so, yeah, I think there's something about asking different questions. And I think that maybe applies in our relationship with health services and policy makers as well.
Any thoughts, Chris, apart from perhaps nodding in agreement? Anything to add?
That was really interesting to hear. Sorry, I don't.
That's fine. It's fine. You know, sometimes, you know, nodding, agreeing is fine. Mark, you do it.
Yeah, it's a very similar point to Nicola's actually. And I was picking up on Chris's point he just made. I think there is a power issue in terms of kind of experience stroke, well, let's say junior researchers, less experienced and more senior ones, and that's what I partly picked up on this point about kind of how we actually do the research, so kind of the methodology of it. I think it's a very different strategy for more junior colleagues, and I think that's really fascinating why you've raised this discussion. You can see there's quite a lot in it, Chris. You know, and I think just finishing a PhD or relatively recently I think that's really good to raise that issue, but I think it does the different kind of strategies and different ways in which we are critical being a critical friend does change over time, and whether that's as an individual, as a team, a department, or even the broader sort of discipline or field. I think that you've raised a lot of really interesting questions there. So yeah, it's more of a comment.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
Okay, just Nicholas come up with something again. That's best just to say thanks. Yes, we will, I'm sure, revisit this in due course. Are there any other issues that people have thought about that they'd like to raise? So if not, we can always end a little bit early. So again, final opportunity. Okay, right. Well, first of all, obviously, thanks a lot to Chris, and obviously welcome back. So it's 3.5 days. So so far, you hopefully you haven't decided you made the wrong option, Chris. You're still happy with 3.5 days. So thanks for coming back and giving us a seminar, and I'm sure we'll catch up in due course. So thanks to everyone who came today. Obviously, it's been an interesting discussion, and particularly thanks for anyone who's raised issues, asked questions, things like that. So I'm sure we'll sort of, well, in Park House in due course, I'm sure we'll carry on and see Chris. Question for Martin. This is an unfair question, and you might not have the answer to this, but I don't have the answer to this. Martin, do you know offhand when the next seminar is? If not, just put it round.
The next one is at, I think it's the 16th of June, and it's a talk by Tom Daniels. What is commissioning? I think the title is.
Okay, great. So take that as a bit of an advert, please, just before we go. So I think Tom is another former PhD student. So it'd be great if people can turn out and listen to Tom for that one as well. And as far as we know, Tom is not coming back, although who knows? I mean, you didn't know you were coming back when you agreed to give the seminar, but so we'll see. So thanks a lot to everyone. So thanks a lot to Chris, and we'll hopefully see you at the next seminar.
Thanks all.
Okay. Bye then. Thanks.